Hello students. Today I am going to discuss the issue of restructuring of United Nations, which has assumed a very major dimension in the post-Cold War era. Now, you all know the origin of the United Nations. Actually, the origin really dates back to the end of the First World War. The devastating consequences of the First World War, as a result of which 8 million people died. And consequently, the leaders of the world who met at the peace conference in Paris, they discussed that the issue of collective security, the issue of peace and international security can no longer be left to the hands of the individual states, and that there was the need for a general international organization which would be entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining peace and security across the world. This ideal of collective security actually gave birth to the League of Nations, which was the first international organization entrusted with the job of maintaining international peace and security. However, the League did not succeed, and the history of the League's failure is a long one. It is not necessary for us to go into the details of that. But the fact remained that the League was paralyzed during the interwar period due to, that is, between the period between 1919 and 1939, due to various reasons, which again we do not have the time to discuss. Finally, the League actually died on the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. However, the ideal of collective security, or the ideal of an international organization entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining peace and security, did not die. And this was resurrected on the completion of the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War. And to be specific, actually, there were a lot of discussions during the war itself among the three major powers, that is the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, regarding the construction of a new international organization. And this discussion actually started from 1941 onwards, with the Atlantic Charter signed by President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain. Subsequently, these discussions actually led to the construction of the United Nations and the adoption of the United Nations Charter at San Francisco in August 1945. And on 24th October 1945, the United Nations came into existence. Since then, actually, 24th of October 1945 is celebrated, observed as the UN Day. In fact, this was the United Nations Charter, which is a very detailed legal document and of course does not need to be discussed here. In fact, had a vision of a world based on the ideals of peace, justice, truth, and fraternity. And these ideals were contained in the preamble of the UN Charter. However, if we very briefly take into account the record of the United Nations between 1945 and 1989, that is during the Cold War period, we find that this record was a rather disappointing record. In fact, the UN was not able to live up to the very high ideals with which it was born in 1945, as I mentioned. The principal reason, of course, was the Cold War. And, in fact, the successful functioning of the United Nations was predicated on the assumption of cooperation among the great powers who founded it in the first place, namely the United States, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. But it is well known that during the Cold War period, actually the Cold War was actually an ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so therefore, these two states did not cooperate, which was actually envisaged while the foundation of the United Nations was being laid. And so therefore, in fact, the United Nations actually did not succeed to the extent, or rather, as much as was expected when it was founded in 1945. However, when the Cold War ended in 1989, new hopes were generated that now that the Cold War was over and the divisions of the Cold War, which were responsible for the not very successful functioning of the United Nations, were no longer there. And so therefore, it was hoped that the United Nations would be able to play a more assertive and a more vigorous role in maintenance of international peace and security. However, these high hopes actually did not really quite materialize. I mean, if we take stock of the performance of the United Nations between 1991 and say today 2016, in fact, we will find that, these high hopes were not fulfilled. The reasons, of course, are manifold. One of the major reasons was that the United Nations was hijacked by the United States. In the absence of, opposition from the Soviet Union, which was very much evident during the Cold War period, as is well known, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and it splintered into 15 new states, and the major successor state, that is Russia, in fact fell into some kind of anarchy and chaos during the 1990s. The United States actually took advantage of that, and it utilized the United Nations as its own instrument to carry out its own agenda in foreign policy. I would give you specific examples such as the Kosovo Crisis of 1999, when in fact the United Nations was bypassed and the United States rallied or marshaled the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, for dealing with the Kosovo crisis along with its allies, without caring for international opinion, other international opinion. Then the history of U.S. intervention in Afghanistan in 2001, following the attacks on the United States, the attacks in New York, the terrorist attacks in New York in September 2001. The United States invaded Afghanistan and uprooted the Taliban regime, which was supposed to have provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which carried out the 9/11 attacks. And here the United Nations was a silent spectator. Then again in 2003, when the United States and Great Britain invaded Iraq, here also the United Nations was bypassed, and the history of that actually is a rather sad one, but we do not have the time to go into those details. So these are, I think, sufficient examples of how the United Nations really became an onlooker or a bystander in an international conflict or in international crisis, where it hardly had any role. And this actually, inflicted a deadly blow to the credibility of the United Nations. So, the question naturally arose that is it not time to restructure the United Nations? That is it not the case that the United Nations would have been better placed to handle these crises that I have just referred to if it was restructured, if its organs, particularly the most vital organ, the Security Council, was more representative, and so on and so forth. These are the questions that have arisen, particularly in the light of what has happened in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. I will deal with two particular issues regarding the reform of the United Nations. It's a very broad question and a very wide question, and so I will try to only focus on the most important aspects of UN reform, namely the restructuring of the Security Council and the development bodies. Let us take up the Security Council first. Now, the Security Council, as we all know, of course, is the principal organ of the United Nations in the maintenance of international peace and security. Now, you may remember the structuring of the Security Council. The Security Council was, in fact, it was, it was, when the Charter was adopted in 1945, the Security Council had 5 permanent members and 6 non-permanent members. Now, it may be recalled that the permanent members have a special privilege, that is, they have the veto power. And the non-permanent members do not have veto powers. Now, the question arose that the representation of the Security Council, as it was created in 1945, essentially was confined to the Western powers, the victor powers, and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council they still continue to be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, as we find at the end of the Second World War, namely the United States, the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union has disintegrated, so its place has been taken by Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. Now, it may be pertinent to mention here that in 1945, China actually was a member, but then when the communist revolution took place in China in 1949, China actually had two representations. There were 2 Chinas actually. One, the mainland China communist government, and the other, the nationalist government, was based in Formosa, or Taiwan as it is known. And because the United States was opposed to communism, so therefore communist China actually was no longer the permanent member in the Security Council, and the Chinese seat was occupied by Taiwan, or Formosa China. But then subsequently in 1971 a change took place when communist China was given the permanent seat in the Security Council. The only change or reform in the composition of the Security Council that took place happened actually in the 1960s, when the number of non-permanent members was increased from 6 to 10. So, as the Security Council stands today, it has 15 members, 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. Now, I may remind you that the permanent members have a veto power. Veto power means that no resolution of the Security Council can be adopted if a permanent member casts a veto, then that resolution cannot be adopted. Now, this privilege has not been given to the non-permanent members. So, the non-permanent members actually do not have a veto, which means that they cannot stop the adoption of a resolution by the Security Council. Only a permanent member can do that. So, as a result, what happened was that right from the beginning, the United Nations actually had the Security Council had two kinds of members. One group of members who enjoyed a special privilege, and the other group of members actually who did not enjoy that privilege. Now, by 2002, there emerged actually an anomaly in the sense that the number of members of the United Nations actually went up manyfold by 2002, from 51 to 191. So therefore, as you can see, that the ratio between members of the United Nations and the members of the Security Council actually increased. Previously, it was 15 to 51. Now it is 15 to 191. Now, so therefore, it is felt that this is an unjustifiable gap, that there should be a wider and greater representation of the newer members who became members of the United Nations during the intervening period. So this obviously has assumed a preliminary question. And as I mentioned a little earlier, that the Security Council, the permanent members comprised primarily of the Western industrialized developed countries. I have already mentioned the names. There is hardly any representation from the developing world, the only exception being China. There is no representation from apart from China, from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, so therefore, there has justifiably emerged a demand for permanent representation in the Security Council from the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Here, the principal claimants are: from Asia, it is India; from Africa, it is South Africa; and from Latin America, it is Brazil, apart from Germany and Japan. Now, Germany and Japan actually are considered to be legitimate claimants for the simple reason that they are industrially advanced and they are developed. The reason why they were not included in the Security Council at the end of the Second World War was the simple one, that they were the defeated nations. Germany was a defeated nation, Japan was a defeated nation, so there was no question of including them in the Security Council. But that scenario has now completely changed. Germany and Japan actually are now new countries with new stature in the international system, and so therefore they are legitimate claimants. Now, of course, there is no dispute regarding the principle of expansion. I think the principle of expansion has been accepted by everybody, including the existing members of the Security Council as well as the claimant nations. But the question is, who will really be included? The claimant nations, and there is no agreement on that so far. Now, there is, of course, Western ambivalence. The P5, that is the 5 permanent members, they are not very enthusiastic. On the face, actually, they say yes, okay. I think it is necessary. It is justified. But when it comes to the question of actually setting in motion the process of restructuring, you find that all kinds of not opposition, but all kinds of reservations actually are mooted and so on and so forth. So therefore, what has happened is that, there is clearly no consensus about who should really become the new members. Apart from that, there is also no consultation. Another complaint against the P5 is that they do not consult those countries who are contributing to peacekeeping operations of the United Nations. Now, this is a very important aspect of United Nations activity, as you might be knowing. This is in fact one area where the United Nations has had a relatively successful role. But here also, there has been the complaint that so far as peacekeeping operations, decisions relating to peacekeeping operations are concerned, those countries which are contributing, actually, that means particularly from the developing countries, they are not consulted, they are not taken into consideration. But after this complaint was mooted, actually, in recent times, we find that there is greater consultation between the permanent members of the Security Council on the one hand and the contributing countries to peacekeeping operations on the other. So this is something, but however, the reform of the Security Council is still deadlocked, and as of now, there is no consensus as to who should be included. Now I pass on to the issue of the development bodies. As the United Nations was not able to play a very useful role in resolution of political conflicts, the more successful side of the UN activity has been its social and economic activities. In fact, the United Nations has played a very important role actually in providing relief and assistance and humanitarian help. Unlike the other international bodies like the World Bank, the IMF, etc., there were no conditionalities attached. That means the United Nations actually gave help to the developing countries without any conditionalities attached. Now, the UN has also played a very important role actually in negotiations between the North and the South, the industrial North and the developing South. And here also it has tried to play, particularly the UNCTAD, played a major role actually in ensuring equitable and just trade terms. However, the Western nations actually, particularly the United States, they have complained that these activities of the United Nations have been wasteful and, inefficient and, and so on and so forth. So they feel that the United Nations role in these areas should be more restricted. And in these areas, that is economic and social development, organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund should play a greater role, and so on and so forth. So this actually remains a rather contested area where the Western nations are not very eager to give greater resources to the United Nations. While at the same time actually depending more on institutions actually which are more stringent, which attach conditionalities like the IMF and the World Bank, and the developing countries actually prefer that the development bodies, particularly the Economic and Social Council, should be further strengthened, and so that they are able to reap the benefits of economic and social development in the times to come. So, in conclusion, I think we can say that the major reforms of the United Nations are still pending, and that they are still on the anvil, And let us hope that a consensus will be reached and the United Nations will be able to play a more meaningful role in international peace and security and economic and social development.